I was exposed to equine-assisted psychotherapy at that barn, which affected me personally, but also academically. And I'm watching these kids come into the program hurting in various capacities, of course, individualized to that person, and then leaving the program seemingly thriving in whatever that looks like for that person. And I asked my mentor at the time, I said, what's happening here, right? I was in the science, I'm a science-minded person. And she was like, oh, it's magic. You just put kids and horses together.
Yeah.
There has to be something happening here.
Yeah.
And that really was the catalyst for my academic career to really, understand what's happening between humans and animals.
There are healers on this planet with the power to soften the suffering of mankind, yet they have remained in the recesses of the world, abused, discarded, and labeled as trash. This is The Touch of a Mustang. I am your host, Shalise Clough, and I'm here to tell the story of wild horses, Mustangs, and the humans who are discovering and sharing their gifts while working to protect their well-being and preserve their spirit, so this divine power won't be lost. Join us on this quest with the Wild Mustang.
Leanne, thank you so much for being here today on the Touch of the Mustang podcast.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
To start with, can you give everybody listening an introduction about yourself, what you do?
Sure. So I am an assistant professor at the Center for the Human-Animal Bond at Purdue University's College of Veterinary Medicine. And so I get to study how humans and animals interact. So most of my work is focused on either human-equine or human-canine interactions, though recently I've been able to work with some other species, which has been fun. But day to day, I study the human-animal bond. So why we are affected by animals and why and how they're affected by us. I do most of my work in the context of trauma, both in equine-assisted interventions as well as canine-assisted or service dog interventions. And most of that is in the military context, though I do work a lot with civilians as well. And then some of my current projects actually work with classrooms and schools. So that's been a fun addition. But on the human side of things, I'm a mom. I have 2 horses at home and a dog and a husband too.
He's also there.
Yeah, and I'm a practitioner of equine-assisted services and have been since 2013. I spent some time working with horses of all different kinds. Unfortunately, I have not had the chance to work with a Mustang for longer than a few minutes.
Well, there's still time. There's always time.
Yes.
And there's always Mustangs.
Yes, but right now I have a Morgan, and then I have a Clydesdale paint cross, but I've had the pleasure of working with many, many different horses who have all had such a profound impact on me as a human, as me as a researcher, as me as a parent, and many, many other ways. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Beautiful. So what other species have you done besides dogs and horses?
Yeah, so
that you're doing now, kind of off topic, but
no. People always ask me, and right now I have a project with chickens, actually.
I love that.
And how chickens may or may not impact empathy in kids. And then I also have a big project right now of pets in the classroom. So these pets are anything from hissing cockroaches to gerbils to hamsters to fish to snakes, kind of any pet that can live in a classroom setting.
Yeah.
That's been especially wonderful to just study something unique and different. And I think, animals are beings and they all offer something unique, just like a human would. So it's been a real privilege to kind of expand to that. But at heart, I'm a horse and dog person. So
the cockroach is an interesting one I have not heard before.
They are picking up actually in popularity across classrooms.
Wow.
Which is fascinating.
That's fun. We do have a classroom at my kid's school that has a ton of pets, and it's one of the most popular classrooms.
Uh-huh.
For sure.
That's awesome.
Tell us a little bit about your journey getting here to where you're really delving into the science of, I think a lot of us can feel it. We're around animals.
Oh,
we
for
know
sure.
It helps us feel better, or it gives us different benefits in life.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get from the beginning to where you are now, where you're studying these things and kind of showing the scientific proof behind it?
Yes. So I I guess it started, and don't worry, this will be quick. It started with my
It's okay if
parents
it's not quick.
when
I
I
mean, we're
was
here to talk about it.
okay.
So.
I don't want to be like when I was born,
Yeah. I mean, a
but
lot of
it's
stories
relevant.
do start pretty far back, but
It's relevant. My parents adopted a puppy when I was 3 months old, and she was 3 weeks old or 3 months old. So I went through a lot of my childhood with my canine sister Daisy, and she just was what a dog and little kid are like. She was my furry sibling. I do have a human sibling as well. Daisy lived till she
harder
was
to get along with
17.
sometimes.
Yes, and she would agree with that too. But yes, Daisy lived till she was 17, so we really did childhood
Yeah,
together.
your whole childhood. Wow.
Yeah, and then I had the privilege of my parents being animal lovers themselves. So I also had a bunny that I got in 3rd grade. She lived for 10 years as well, and she taught me a ton about the human-animal relationship in a different way than Daisy did. But she was the coolest bunny. She was litter trained. She could play soccer. She
That is
would get
cool.
dressed up in clothes because 3rd graders do that and carry
Right.
around and push them around in a baby stroller. And now we have all these fun pictures. Ultimately, Daisy and Dusty kind of shaped my early childhood. And then I was a competitive figure skater, actually, which now the Olympics are going on, so people are more in
That's
tune to
cool.
that. But I got hurt. And I had always said that if I got hurt skating, there was a horse barn down the street from my house, and we had grown up going down there like in the stroller and saying hi to the horses, but never kind of any interest in like fully adopting the horse lifestyle.
Yeah. It's a lot.
Yeah, luckily or unluckily, I got hurt skating, and I was pretty competitive, so I was skating, daily for hours, and all of a sudden I had a lot of time, and I do not do well just sitting around, so I ended up starting to volunteer at the barn, and for about 6 months, I just loved being there. I loved being around the horses. The barn owner was so kind and compassionate and just kind of welcomed me with open arms to be a helping hand. I think there were about 12 horses on the farm at the time, and I literally spent 6 months just grooming them, doing stalls, taking care of them, really just on the taking care of them and bonding and getting to know what it's like to be around a horse and all of that. And about 6 months in, she was like, "Do you want to ride? Do you have any interest in riding?" It was not like a lesson barn or anything. So I said, "Yeah, at this point, I think, I do want to learn to ride." So she paired me up with a horse named Buck, who was a schoolmaster. He was 27 at the time, and had a long history with his mom, who ended up teaching me a little bit, competing and being a show horse. And he was awesome. He literally set me up in so many ways, both in my life and in my horse life and in my research life, in ways that I can't ever thank him enough for. And I just got to explore what it's like to be a friend of a horse. And I learned how to ride. I often say like he taught me how to ride, because I took, a few lessons here and there, but nothing like official of sorts. But I'd get on and, try to figure out his buttons. Does this button, what does this do? And button being, what do I need to do to my body to make him go or stop or communicate? Exactly. And I think at that time, it was buttons to me, but I think at the same time, it was the beginning of an understanding of what is possible when you have a horse partner. And where I was like hopping on bareback was not normal, but I was like, I think I'll get on bareback. I think I'll get on a halter, and just kind of as a kid explore what that was like. Buck was so kind that he never dumped me, but he did vocalize his needs in various ways, maybe not vocally, but with body language. And then, so then I went to college and left them at home. There were some other horses, of course, there that also had tremendous impacts on me, but for the sake of time, I won't go through all 12. And then I went to school and I wanted to be a veterinarian at the time. I'd want to be a veterinarian my whole life. And then I got involved in some research where I was actually doing biochemistry research with neonatal piglets. So we were looking at how adding something to their diet would change gut barrier function. And that was a measure for human infants. And at the same time, I wanted to get some hours for veterinary school. So I began working at a nonprofit that did equine-assisted psychotherapy for teenage girls who'd experienced various forms of trauma. And again, I started out as a horse person, right? I wanted to go to vet school, so it was all, horse-minded. And luckily, I was exposed to equine-assisted psychotherapy at that barn, which affected me personally, but also academically. And I realized through those experiences that, I'm watching what this change to a pig diet does to their gut. And I'm also watching these kids come into the program hurting in various capacities, of course, individualized to that person, and then leaving the program seemingly thriving in whatever that looks like for that person. And I asked my mentor at the time, I said, what's happening here, right? I was in the science, I'm a science-minded person. And she was like, oh, it's magic. You just put kids and horses together.
Yeah, that's
And I
what
was
it feels
like,
like, right?
well, yeah, I don't want to,
Can we say
lower
that
the
in
magic, but there has to be something happening here.
Yeah.
And that really was the catalyst for my academic career to really, understand what's happening between humans and animals and how that could work. And I think horsemanship wise, this barn was very different than the Morgan show barn I grew up learning to ride in. She put me in a round pen with I think she was a 7-year-old thoroughbred, and handed me like a tissue essentially and was like, okay, you can go ride. And I was like, saddle, bridle, halter. She was like, no, she's like, you can use the mounting block, climb on from the fence, like whatever you need.
Yeah.
You have to have a relationship with this horse before you do anything. And, as a college student, I was what? But that moment was pivotal for me. Even now, I do dressage now, but I do everything that I can do in tech, I try to do without tech, because it really demonstrates what the relationship looks like and that communication piece. Career trajectory changed at that point, and I decided to get my master's, and I actually got my master's in communication, which people were like, how'd you go from animal science to communication? That's weird. But it actually fundamentally set me up for my later career. So I learned how to think differently. I learned how to go from, the heavy science to the softer science, which I would argue with those terms. But I got to study behavior, and communication is behavior. And I got to focus on nonverbal communication and family communication and relationship communication, which can all be intertwined into our relationships with animals.
Yeah.
And then once at that time, I also started doing some research in human equine interaction at the nonprofit that I had been working with, looking at what are the communicative processes that are happening that are promoting resilience in these young girls. And since then, that research has been published. And of course, I ended up doing my PhD in human-animal interaction, which was an opportunity that came across my desk. And I was like, wow, this exists. This is a thing. And I, got to take both of my backgrounds in, animal science and in communication and put them together in a really interdisciplinary way for my PhD in human-animal interaction. And, have been consistent from, high school through college. I ended up taking one of the horses from the barn as my horse when I was a sophomore in college. He's still with us. His name is Bentley. He's a Morgan, and I actually had the privilege of knowing his mom, and at the barn as well. So he has been with me since college. So lived in multiple states, been through multiple life changes for me, graduating, getting married, having a baby, the whole thing. So he's been a constant. Yeah. And then I've had the privilege of having 2 other horses. One, unfortunately, we lost. Her name was Izzy, and she had a huge impact on me as well. And then my other horse right now is Fergus, and he's a Clydesdale paint. So it's been a real privilege to kind of have them in my life, and all the animals that I've been, able to learn from and interact with.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about first some of the things you found in research, and then if you're open to sharing some of the ways that they've personally affected you, I'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah.
But so in all your research and in the things you've explored, what are some of the things that you've found? What is this magic that horses do that we all feel, but kind of hard to put into words at times?
Yeah, no. So I mentioned the study that we did during my master's degree, and that was on the resilience processes that occurred with the youth at that program. If you're going to edit this.
Yeah, of course.
So in that study, we looked at, again, the program that the girls were going through that had a component of equine-assisted psychotherapy, but it also included vocational training, academic tutoring, as well as just farm chores and learning, how to function around a working horse farm. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we were looking at how, the girls came into the program with many different risk factors. They each, of course, had their own experiences, but they kind of all fit in that realm of trauma, from, sex trafficking through sexual assault through kind of the whole gamut.
Yeah.
And we were seeing these changes, and we ultimately did a study where my mentor spent time at the farm for a semester observing what was happening. And we looked specifically at the communication processes that were occurring between the kids, the horses, and the adults that were around. So there was always a mental health professional. It was equine-assisted psychotherapy. So that psychotherapy piece, there was a mental health professional there. And then there was an equine specialist who was responsible for the horse's safety, essentially. And then a client horse, and usually sometimes more clients, sometimes more horses, but usually individual sessions. And we found that through the communication processes that were occurring between all of these different players, there was this communication of resilience. So there's this theory by Patrice Bazanel about communicative resilience. And it has these processes that occur through communication that promote resilience after a difficult situation. And they are crafting normalcy. So creating a space where routines potentially become normal, building new communication networks. So finding that support elsewhere and learning how to communicate and how not to communicate amongst your networks, legitimizing negative feelings while foregrounding positive action, right? So you might be feeling negatively about something, but what can we do positively from that? And I think working with horses, sometimes it's difficult, right? Just like working with people is difficult. So that came through, and then putting alternative logics to work. So if something wasn't working, what's an alternate for that? And then cultivating this identity of empowerment. So these 5 tenets of this communicative resilience theory had existed in this communication theory realm, right? But it had never been applied to horses. In this particular setting, that's what we found there. And then since then, my work currently focuses on military veterans and their families, as well as first responders. So I'm partnered with an organization out in Reno, Nevada, that provides equine-assisted learning to veterans, first responders, and their families. And that study is not published yet, so I can't speak to outcomes yet. But what we did is we looked at pre-post and follow-up surveys as well as interviews to understand, fundamentally what impact is this program having on these individuals, both in the moment and long-term retention of that. And I can say the findings are, not shocking to horse people or to people who've been
telling us
by a
what
horse.
we know, probably.
But the methodology that we used kind of is the same methodology used to evaluate other forms of mental health intervention, which it's important for the researchers to do that because that's what stands up when we talk about insurance coverage or, providing opportunities for individuals who don't know about horses, for example, to experience them in the context of mental health. I've also done some work with the Professional Association of Therapeutic Horsemanship. So I'm on a few committees for them, and we published recently data about helmet fitting for different individuals. So the accessibility of a helmet and the access it might give people to horses. And then I've done some work also looking at inclusion and belonging in the context of the equine-assisted work as well. So what human structures are in place that may affect equine-assisted interventions for people.
What were some of the conclusions that you were able to draw from, especially maybe that first one with the girls in trauma? Like, what was it about the horses that seemed to be helping them?
Yeah, I think, it comes down to the relationships they were able to build with them and their ability to take what they were learning from the horses outside of the ring. So we saw kids trying to get a horse's attention in really a way that wasn't working. And a lot of times, whether that's being too loud or too soft, a horse won't respond or they'll respond really largely. So they can take, maybe if I fly into the arena at full speed, waving everything around, my horse is going to go flying to the other end. It was a huge arena. And that's a really visual cue of maybe I need to think about how I'm approaching different situations. And they could take that, to school and say, okay, when I don't want to do my assignment, it's probably not appropriate for me to throw the paper around the room and jump up and down, right? And, you're laughing, but this was a real thing for kids. And, having them be like, wow, when I, walked slowly and was breathing and went up to, Ruffy, she stood there. And she turned her head towards me and she put her nose down and she was there. She was with me. And she's like, when I go to school, I tried, take a deep breath when I was walking up to a friend or a teacher or, whatever that may be. And it worked. Or my parent told me this and it worked. So I talked about it with kids, but in the military work I do, a lot of the veterans that I worked with are also first responders, right? So they're police, SWAT, fire, and they talk about how what they experience with the horses they take to their daily lives, right? If they know they're going to walk into a super difficult situation, they remember the moment that they had with the horse and how they had to breathe or had to ground themselves or had to be clear with their communication, and they can directly put that in practice in their daily lives, whether that be with their personal relationships or their, occupational relationships, whatever that may be. So that carryover piece of the communication and the responses that horses give us is really key. And I think too, when you think about it, people hurt people, right? So especially with kids who've experienced hurt, a horse is a safe place because some of them have never been around a horse. Most of them haven't been around a horse, right? So it's a new thing. And they're watching the people that they're working with also work with a horse, right? So as an equine specialist, for example, if I had a relationship with a horse and I could, go get that horse ready for the session or just say hi to that horse on my way to the barn, they saw that and the kids watched the adults interact. And, horses are very clear with their communication, of course. And I think for many kids, that showed them that I was also safe, potentially, right? Not at first. But, I was a safe place because, Ruffy trusted me or Chester trusted me or Bentley did. And that kind of catalyzed them to begin to trust humans again and work on those communicative processes that are so important to our daily functioning, but in the context of that safety of the horse. And, boundary setting too. There's so many pieces there.
It's a really interesting practice ground because, it's different than like role playing with a person or something like that because, that is pretend. With horses. It's almost like you get that real situation, you get the real feedback most of the time in a safe way. It's not totally safe, right? Horses do have an element of danger, which I even wonder if part of that adds to it, that it's like there is potential for danger, but interaction can change and like minimize that danger. So it's a really interesting idea that this is kind of a place for them to practice and then go and take that into the real world that they're living in day in and day out, or the human world. Horses are the real world, but
yeah. And I think too, like, the danger piece, sometimes kids or adults, would come into sessions, from a practitioner point or a researcher standpoint and be like, I'm afraid, right? Like, that's a big animal, right? Draft horse or pony.
Especially if you haven't been around them.
Exactly. And they'd be like, they have hooves, they can kick me, they can bite me. And, as a practitioner, I would always respond to that with, so can I. And that always would like loosen it up, but also recognize like, yes, that is true, right? There is, an element of safety here. And, for some people, especially survivors of trauma, that learning how to keep yourself safe and trusting that you can keep yourself safe within a network, within a relationship, that's key. So, you're correct. And sessions, I think a lot of times people think, oh, equine assisted interventions, like, you get to stand with a horse and love on them and pet them. And, sometimes you do. Yep.
Yeah,
but sometimes, you get in the field and your horse says, I'm feeling it today. And they run to the other end of the 50-acre pasture. And you have to traipse behind them and see, are they just not feeling it? Or, are they responding to something within me? And I think sometimes those situations teach us even more than the situations that go directly as we had planned.
Learning some real skills in how cause and effect, really, how you behave.
Exactly.
Did you find that this would naturally transfer, or is it something that was talked a lot about, like, see how this happened, think about this when you go to school, or is it something that was more natural where it clicked for them on their own?
It clicked for them. I think, at least in my experience as a practitioner, like, I don't like to scaffold too much, right? I don't like to say like, oh, you should take this to school, because I think the natural consequence and the natural experience, not experiential education, is really important. And for a lot of these kids, some of them had oppositional defiant disorder and all of these things and some of them just didn't like adults, right? So if I were to say like, oh, you should bring this to school, they'd be like, watch me not bring it to school.
Right. Almost create more resistance by giving them prompts to go that way.
And I think, same thing with adults. I think that personal piece and that experience that you go through as an individual when you're working with a horse in whatever capacity that might be, I think that's the piece where the magic lies, right? And that's something that I have graduate students and postdocs that work with me, and some of them don't have horse experience. And that's my favorite, because I take them out into my pasture and I, give them the experience of working with a horse, and they always leave that session or that time with my horse, I'm going to call it a session, time with my horses, and they're like, whoa, I get it. Like, I understand what our participants are describing now in a way that like I did not get
Yeah.
beforehand. So that experiential piece is really key, I think.
Yeah. That's really interesting that and I think that speaks to kind of the magic of it that we see is we don't really know that we're building those skills that are then
Right.
becoming embedded in our minds that are like, "Oh, here are some other options of how I might be able to address this situation." That's neat.
Right.
With the ones you've seen, how long does this take for it to have a real effect? Have you seen?
I think from the researcher standpoint, I can't answer that question because we
Mhm.
don't know, right? This field and studying human horse interaction or just human animal interaction in general is really young. It
Yeah.
really came to be in the 1970s and 80s, which when you think about that compared to like physics and the apple falling from the tree, right? Like there's a lot that we need to learn on
Yeah.
the research side of things. So research wise, I can't answer that. I think practice wise, I think it truly depends on the person. I think some people, have interaction with a horse and it's life changing. And other people, spend months and months and months and months and months. And, from the outside, it looks like nothing's happening. But I think, there is something happening inside. And then one day they just get it. And why that is, I'm not really sure yet. But I think, even like we had one kid, I'll never forget this, that literally was like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be around the horses. But she's like, I will lay on this fence. And we literally had a wooden fence, and she would lay on the top bowl, and we just have the horses around in the arena or in the pasture. And for weeks, she just laid there. And the therapist was like, you know, we're just going to let her, see what happens. And, we'd join her. Like I'd lay on the, rail underneath her. She thought that was hilarious. But, we'd build that relationship and just sit there in silence, right? And then one day the horses just became interesting, right? They would come over, check on us, and then she would, say something like, oh, he didn't come over at the time he usually did today. Like he came over earlier. And she'd start to notice these things. And the horses were just kind of, doing what they do to work on this kid. And eventually one day, without prompting, she just got off the fence and started working with a horse, walking around the pasture, no instruction at all, right? Just started working with this pony and just walking around, petting him, he was eating grass. She'd go pick some grass and bring it back. And then their relationship really blossomed over time. She ended up, riding and doing all of those things, but it took a really long time. But I think to this day, she would say he had a profound impact on her healing because he was always there. He never left her. And he had the choice to leave. Like we had a huge arena, and then the arena backed up to multiple pastures, so they could go wherever they wanted, and he always kind of hung around.
Interesting. Do you find that horses usually pair up with someone like that?
I think typically I would say yes. I think sometimes, horses are such individuals, right? And they're sentient.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes horses like to be around people, and sometimes some horses are like, I can see you. If you need me, come get me. But, I'll be over here. Like my two horses, one of them is very much like, I love you, but I'm going to go over here if you need me.
Yeah.
I'll be willing to join you. But then the other one's like, ooh, what are you doing? Can I follow you around?
True, yeah, different personalities for sure.
Yeah. So I think in that regard, I think people are drawn to different things in horses. I think horses are drawn to different things in people. So it's interesting to watch people with different horses too, and watch horses with different people.
Yeah.
It's all about, again, that communication and that relationship that's built and, why we do what we do for both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I hear lots of stories about unexpected partnerships a lot of time where someone thinks that horse would never have done something like that, but with this particular person, they did do that.
That's like the most exciting part is, taking people, whether it be in the context of an equine-assisted intervention, just in general, out into a field of horses and seeing, what unravels, because there's always some communication occurring that can be so meaningful for either the person themselves or somebody watching, right? Or, the horse themselves. No, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Have you seen any difference? Is there any insights into more structured programs versus like that girl that's kind of spending time with the horse?
That's a really great question. And that's something that we have not studied officially. I think most of the studies, at least that I'm aware of, are more structured programs in the context of equine assisted services. But that's something that I'm on a research team that we're interested in looking at that. So what is the difference between a structured program versus, a sanctuary type model where, the horses aren't in a pasture, right? They're on hundreds of acres and have the choice to interact or not, versus, a program that brings a horse into a barn, puts him on the cross ties, tacks him up and brings him into the arena. And I'm not saying either one is better or worse than the other, but they have different implications. And I've written a paper on kind of the spaces that we're doing the work with our horses and what implications they may have for both animal welfare, but also human welfare, right? And our experiences in different spaces, again, carry over into our experiences with horses too. If you're not comfortable in small spaces, being, in between two horses on a cross tie, getting ready, it's probably going to be pretty uncomfortable. You'd probably be much more confident in a field at liberty with the horse. So just being aware of those spaces, I think, is important. But yeah, research-wise, we have not directly compared that yet.
Interesting. And anything from that paper that you can share as far as what those
Yeah.
spaces
Yeah, so it was more of a theoretical piece to just say to the practitioners, hey, you should be paying attention to where you're doing your sessions. And some practitioners have the privilege of choice, do they do it in an arena, a pen, a stall, wherever, and some don't. So, being aware of that, but just understanding the implications of that, right? What does it do to the horse to go get them from the field, bring them to the cross ties and do a session in a stall versus bring the client out to the field, right? And we know that, for example, horses are herd animals. So if you pull a horse out of a herd, some of them are very confident and happy to go up to the barn by themselves. Others are not so confident,
very
right?
unhappy? Yeah.
Could you bring an extra horse up with you if you need to, do something like that? Or can you bring the client to the field? So from the horse welfare, that's kind of where that conversation went. And then from the human side, something as being in a small space versus a large space, a lot of times thinking about individuals, for example, that have been sexually assaulted, riding can be very challenging. And I'm not generalizing for all, but that can be a really difficult situation. That closeness and just the positioning is just not a good thing for them.
Mhm.
So are you, as a practitioner, aware of that, right? Are you thinking about the different spaces and where you're taking them? If they're taking them on a trail ride, is that something that they want to do? Or is that something that's terrifying to them because the safety is in the barn? And again, it's so dependent on the person and the horse, but just really trying to get practitioners to think about, what are we doing? And I think, horse people in general, we all have our routines that we do with our horses.
Yeah.
And just thinking about, am I doing something? Why am I doing something, right? Like, why am I doing it this way when I could do it this way?
Yeah.
And again, there's nothing wrong, right, inherently with any of it necessarily. But perhaps there could be, but just
Another
thinking,
conversation, but yeah.
just thinking about, what you're doing and why you're doing it, and what your horse could think of it and what you're experiencing in it as well.
I think that's great, questioning it, because there are a lot of things that we do out of tradition, or that's the way we learned, or that's what we were told. And I say this a lot, but there's a lot of rules that we perceive as like hard and fast. Like, you do this and you
Yes.
don't do this.
Yep.
And to question those, like, is that necessary? Do I have to do it that way? Is there another way? Is defying that rule necessarily going to lead to this outcome I've been told it will lead to? So
Right.
really neat to explore, and also can be kind of frowned upon sometimes in the equine world, or just
For sure.
different people's perspectives from what they've
Exactly.
learned and found. Any other interesting findings or things that you're studying?
One piece that we haven't talked about is the fact that horses bring people together, whether that be physically, right, in spaces where you have to go to the barn where your horse is boarded, or, you go on a trail ride and you join a group of people, or, if you walk into a meeting, for example, at work, and you notice someone has a horse sticker on their water bottle or something, right? That is an open invitation, right? To say, do you have horses? Or if somebody, if you're in a new space and, you see something or they say something and you're like, that sounded like a horse person, they create this community. And I think, a lot of times that community is really positive, but I think sometimes it could be negative as well. And I just think from the healing perspective, being aware of that community and the implications of it can be tremendous. Like in my veteran and military work, that camaraderie in that community is huge, right? That is so important. And I would argue, for any human, having that community is really important, and that social support that comes from that. And we often talk about pets being, a catalyst for communication and a catalyst for relationships. You're more likely, say, to talk to somebody if you take your dog on a walk than if
Yeah.
you just go on a walk yourself. And that's scientifically explained, which is funny. But it's, the same thing could be happening in the horse world. And it's just creating that human to human connection over, shared passion or interest, which I think is
Yeah,
interesting to think
definitely
about.
an interesting aspect because certainly that need to belong to have a community is something that we all have.
Exactly.
And so, especially if we're not, feeling that. Did you
Mhm.
find that to be a piece with the girls or even
Yes,
with the veterans? Well, you kind of mentioned with
both.
the veterans, but with the girls also?
Yeah. Yeah, because many of them had even some of them, for example, were gang involved. So like that is
Mm,
obviously a very complicated community.
community.
So finding alternative healthy communities was something that wasn't within reach for them. And the program really helped to create that community with peers that was healthy and supervised, but then also the community with adults and horses and, barn cats and the staff dogs, right?
Yeah.
This larger network of
Yeah.
beings that could edge that forward.
Yeah. Very interesting. What are some of the things that you found with dogs?
So most of my work to date has focused on service dogs for veterans with
Hmm.
PTSD. So we've done um, many different studies from like physiological cortisol awakening responses through like qualitative based work. So in our physiology studies, we looked at the cortisol awakening response, which essentially when you wake up in the morning, you have a peak of cortisol. And most people experience the peak about 15 minutes after they wake up, and then it kind of drops off after that. And when you are diagnosed with PTSD, that cortisol peak is blunted. So because your body is in a constant state of stress, your body just stops responding in the way that it was made to do in the context of cortisol. So we compared veterans who had a service dog versus those who were in usual care waiting for a service dog. And we found that veterans with a service dog had more typical cortisol awakening response profiles than those who didn't. So on a physiological level, the service dog seems to be impacting veteran mental health.
Yeah.
We've also done some work with sleep patterns. We've done some work with expectations and experiences. So what does it look like to bring a dog into the home, a service dog specifically, and what implications does that have for your family? A lot of my work there has focused on the partners, so the romantic partners of veterans with service dogs, and talking about the impacts of the dogs on them. Though the dog is trained to do tasks for the veteran themselves, obviously the dog is interacting within the family system. So what indirect effects are the dogs having on spouses or children? And we found some interesting things there, both on the context of like affect and emotion, as well as sleep patterns and such. So it's really interesting to think about the dog side, but also how does that compare or not to the horse side and, the different pieces there. But
Yeah. What are some of the differences you found or some of the things that have been interesting that
yeah.
you found?
Yeah. So I guess the fundamental difference, of course, is, the dog lives in the home with the veteran, right? And the
Yeah.
horse doesn't. And I
Much
think
much closer.
right, which when you think about like attachment styles and, attachment theory, it's different because the dog is the proximity maintenance piece, which is one of the tenets of attachment theory. The dog is there all the time, right? And the horse, in the context of, equine-assisted work, maybe once or twice a week. In the context of ownership or leasing, obviously that might be way more than that. But still, most horses are not sleeping on their
Yeah. Not
owner's
usually.
bed. Yeah. But I think, we haven't done a study. There's been one study done by another team comparing dog and horse, but it was a kind of a preliminary study. So we haven't really looked at the differences scientifically yet. But when you think about access, that's definitely something to consider. It's much easier to get a dog into a
Yeah.
situation than a horse. But people are being really creative with getting horses into situations where horses typically wouldn't be, like, the therapy horses going to nursing homes or, people bringing horses to hospitals for helping with both the patients in the hospital, but also the providers and providing that stress release, putting up panels outside in the parking lot. And of course, I would be remiss to say when we're doing these things, we need to be thinking about the horse welfare as well.
Yeah.
Some horses are
Absolutely.
perfectly fine
Yeah.
being in a grass piece of a parking lot, right? Other
Right.
horses, no,
Not
right?
every horse is gonna be able to walk through a hospital.
But yeah, so it's interesting to kind of think about that and the differences between them. But scientifically, that's something that, I really hope to look into further moving forward. especially in the context of service dog versus equine-assisted intervention. Though many of my service dog handlers have also experienced equine-assisted interventions, which that's something that I was not expecting. But in talking to them, a lot of the time I get, oh, you also look at horses? Like, I see the horse picture, like I did, this one day. And it's just really cool to see kind of how individuals in that context are kind of seeing the value of both non-human animals.
In your experience, have you seen individuals where they just don't have that connection with the horse or with animals? It's just not maybe what they need?
Yeah, I think so. And I think as a researcher, we always have to say it's not for everyone, right? This intervention might not be for everyone. And I think a lot of times, people are like, oh, you don't like dogs? Like, what's wrong with you, right? But like, fundamentally, like, that's fine. Some people just don't
I know,
like
I'm curious.
animals.
My husband, like horses, no.
Yeah. And that's okay. And I think, that's something that we need to consider. And, when I talk about, for example, for PTSD, there's a lot of traditional interventions that have evidence behind them that work. But a lot of these traditional interventions have really high dropout rates. People don't want to try them because they're really challenging. And, they just don't work super great for everyone. Like if that was existed, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, if we could find the perfect cure, let's use it.
Exactly. But it's more of a puzzle, right? So if we need to look at the different puzzle pieces that come together. So for someone, that missing piece of the puzzle might be a service dog. For others, it might be equine-assisted interventions. For others, it might be yoga. For others, it might be art therapy, right? And I think as a provider in that context, especially in the context of mental health, understanding what puzzle pieces are available and how to put them together for your particular client that's sitting in front of you at that moment in time is the critical element. So for me, I think about my work is filling in some puzzle pieces, right? That people eventually will be able to say, okay, you are presenting with this, you like animals or you don't like animals, right? So, could do this or you could not do this and, have that conversation.
I wonder, and maybe you've seen this or have insights into it. Are people self-selecting for stuff they're interested in, which they then stick with, which then ends up being more effective?
Yes and no. So yes, some of the individuals, for example, in my equine-assisted services studies, they sought out equine-assisted intervention because they love horses, whether they've never touched one before, but they've always found them magnificent and wanted to interact with them, or they grew up on a ranch, right? They were looking for the horse piece of things. Other people find it as a last resort. So they've literally tried everything and nothing is working. And somebody in their life, whether that be their provider, that be a friend, an ad on TV, a news story, right? They go, like, I'm going to give that a shot. It's free, right? Yeah, it's free. I'm going to try it. And that's how they find their way in. So I think even those people, at least in my experience, tend to finish out the program and not drop out. And oftentimes they're the ones that come around on the other side and are advocating hard to get those interventions into mainstream conversations, for example, like at the VA or within their, veteran specific organizations. Exactly.
Are there any other differences you've seen between the people who maybe were drawn to horses and those who were kind of last resorting it?
Yeah, I think, the people who were drawn to horses that have experience with horses, we all have this kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier too. We all have like what we think it should look like when you interact with a horse, like how you should catch them, how you should groom them, right? How you should tag them, right? How you should work with them. And I think a lot of times, those traditional conversations don't align with what happens in an equine facilitated interaction. And I think a lot of times people come in with these. I remember one participant was talking about how they had, like backed horses, like multiple in their life and had worked with, untouched horses of all kinds. And they came into the program and they were like, yeah, it is so different than what I've ever done. So that for them was a really challenging thing to get over because they thought they were really good at it, right? And they come in and they were like, this is different than, my experience.
And we're having to challenge a lot of beliefs.
Exactly. And then, people who come in who've never touched a horse before are a little bit more open-minded sometimes. And they're, more willing to, try something that might be unconventional or odd. They care less about what people are looking at because they don't know any different, right? So I think that's what I've noticed. But I hope to have some data behind it soon. Because I think
so many
that's
interesting
important.
angles to research, but It's great that it is starting to come out and to show like there is something there. It's not just a bunch of crazy people who are
Yeah.
saying horses are magic. Anything else on the research that's
I guess I do want to. So I was looking into some of the recent work on the horse-human connection, and it's growing exponentially. But I wanted to note that in the last like 3 months, so from September, November, and December of 2025, 3 different scales to measure human equine interaction were published, which that is a lot of scales focused on the
yeah.
human-horse relationship in the context of attachment to come out in a
Mm.
very short period of time. And they all have a little bit different of an approach to measuring the horse-human relationship. Most of them are in the context of attachment theory and the insecure attachment versus avoidant attachment versus secure attachment. And they all, of course, kind of look at different populations. But I just thought that was really interesting to note that people are fascinated by this human-horse interaction and relationship, depending on who you're talking to, partnership, right? And they're trying to measure it quantitatively. They're using, like, one of them actually took a pet attachment questionnaire and adapted it to a horse, whereas others kind of took more of the human to human attachment scales and kind of combined them for a horse human attachment scale. So it's really exciting to see that happening just moving forward, because people are recognizing that there is an attachment potentially between humans and horses, right? Which all of us who have horses are like, well, yeah. But it's going to be really neat to see kind of how that plays into the interactions that we see and the outcomes that we see from, for example, equine-assisted interventions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, yeah.
You mentioned something earlier, which I meant to ask you about and forgot.
Sure.
What have you seen in relation to boundaries and people learning about boundaries as they work with horses?
That comes up all the time in research and in practice as an
Yeah,
equine-assisted
the big one.
practitioner.
I feel like,
I think, the one that gets me every time is if you say, oh, go say hi to that horse. What do people do? They immediately walk up and grab them, right? Touch them
and touch them,
somewhere.
touch their face.
And I think, when I'm doing equine assisted work or training people to do it, I will often tell the person beforehand, of course. But if I have like a person I know, I'll let everybody go do it. And I do it with horses, of course, that are welcoming to that, or we'll just walk away and they can,
Yeah.
set those boundaries themselves.
They
But when
set a
I
calm
circle everyone,
boundary.
exactly. But when I bring everyone back, I will purposefully like walk up to the person that I told I was going to do this and be like, hello, how are you today? And people are always like, what are you doing?
Right? It's so
But
uncomfortable in
then-
our human world.
Right. But then I say, how many of you just went up? And I never want to blame. So I do some
Yeah.
rapport building before I directly ask that. And it's more of a,
I still do it.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, never mind. You didn't want that right now. Sorry.
yeah. So, people are often like, oh my goodness, like I didn't even think about that, right? Like I did not think that that was even a thing. And then I start asking questions like, well, what did the horse do when you did that? And they're like, well, they walked away, or they turned their head away, or they tried to bite me, or, all these things. And I'm like, so why'd you keep doing it? And they're like, because that's what you do. And I'm like, like think about
Interesting
that.
correlation.
Yeah, exactly. And then we go into, like, and I'm not a therapist, so I don't cross the mental health line, but, I'll say, think about what other places in your life do you do this? And then of course, I give them a chance again to go back out and have a different type of interaction. And sometimes I'll say, like, don't touch them. Don't need to touch them. Like, see what you can do with your body without touching them. You talk to people, and we'll do it with people too. I'll be like, okay, go move this person, but don't touch them. And I think just understanding the presence that your body has, and the impact of your energy, and the space between the beings. Right? There's so many different pieces there that I think with a horse, they're so visual for humans, right? Like, oh,
Yeah.
the horse doesn't want to work with me, so they literally galloped across the field, right? Like that is a clear vision that like, something's not right. And some people are like, oh, they're just grumpy today, right? And I'm like, I think we need to do some, self-talk here, and like, are we putting the blame on the horse, or are we really looking at ourselves and thinking like, what impact did I have on that? And I'm saying, not every time the horse goes galloping across the field it's because of an ungrounded human, right? Sometimes there's legitimate reasons, but I think as humans, we do need to be so aware of these boundaries, and boundaries that perhaps we don't think about on a daily basis. What is your boundary for people? Some people are hyper aware of what their boundary is. Some people have no idea. And some people, don't think about what other people's boundaries are either. So again, those carry over from kind of in the horse human realm to the human realm. It's really important. And of course, understanding horses, right? They all have their own boundaries too within the herd and how they move each other and coexist with each other. I think, it's just all about that communication and understanding. But yeah, the boundary piece comes up with my work with the kids, with the veterans. It comes up actually with my work in the dogs as well. And not only like physical boundary, but what do they like? What do they don't like? How can I support those likes and dislikes?
Gives really clear perspective taking when you can kind of put yourself in that place. And then it's also interesting because I feel like when it's human to human, we can get so caught up in our thoughts and we can say, well, that's because they're grouchy, not because of something I did. Instead
Right.
of being like, well, it may be true that they're grouchy, but also you have a piece to it also. Understand that every interaction we have is a two-way interaction, that we're both
Mm-hmm.
playing a part in it. It's
Mm-hmm.
really neat. It's a
Mm-hmm.
neat skill to teach, especially for
Yes.
kids or those in situations where boundaries really are. If some good boundaries could be put in place, it could really change relationships and
Mm-hmm.
people's mental health because they can realize, like, oh, it's getting to
Exactly.
be too much. I need to set a boundary, or they're setting a boundary for me. I need to respect that type of thing. So, really powerful skills to learn for sure. So, tell us a little bit about what your experience has been with horses, the impact they've had on you.
That's such a hard question,
I
but so
know.
easy. It's such a hard question, but such an easy question at the same time. I think horses have tremendously shaped my life. So for example, when I found Buck, who I mentioned earlier, like I was going through some stuff that was pretty challenging. So going to the barn, not only kind of because I got hurt skating, but for some other reasons as well, was kind of my escape of the world. But it was my escape of the world, but he was really in tune to what was happening with me, I think, from a human perspective, not from a researcher perspective.
Yeah.
And
We're back to the human
yeah,
medicine.
we're back to the human. And he would just call me out on things, right? Like if I came in with whatever I was carrying that day, I had to leave it at the gate before I did anything with him. And he was pretty kind about it. He would set boundaries, but he would be very strict with his boundaries, but he would also do it in a very polite way. I think so. Bentley is my Morgan that I got in college. And I don't even know how to describe him. He has had tremendous impact just on my learning to work with horses. I mean, he has put up with a lot from me, but he also gives it back, which I appreciate. So we have a very communicative relationship, you could say. He and I, he's awesome. He's done a lot of everything together. We've done some hunter jumper, we've done some eventing, we've done some dressage, we've, fox hunted.
Wow.
And with him in his prime, he's a little bit older now and has some arthritis, so we don't do as much as we used to, but I could I could lay him down, get on with no tack, jump a 2-6 course, lay him down and get off. And he loved that. Like the fact that he could do what he loved to do and I was just a passenger, that was his thing. Same like when we'd go trail riding. We would go get to a river, for example, and like little stream. I wouldn't call it river.
Yeah.
He loved to jump. I would, as a human, you go like, oh, do we need to go down? Like, or do I need to canter to that? Or do I need to trot to that? Like,
Yeah,
we try to like
overthinking it.
control what's happening, right? And I learned very quickly that I just needed to literally drop my reins and say,
Yeah.
okay, Bentley,
Like I
take
know
care
how
of
to
us.
navigate around. I got this.
Yeah, and he knew where his feet were, right? Fundamentally, it changed my perspective of control and of working together with someone. Is there, and he still does that every day. I think I had a baby 5 months ago, and he during the whole pregnancy was kind of like, something's up, and I don't really understand it. But like I'll still, be with you, but like, man, not so much. And then she came out, and obviously like I wear her a lot out there. Then like at first he was very interested in her. Like, what is that? Why is she there? And then of course like she's just an extension of me. So now he just kind of looks at her like, okay, you can do this. And she's learning to like grab things and move her hands. So she loves to like grab him and stuff. So he fundamentally, I think, someone else would be like, what are you doing? Like he's unpredictable when he's actually very predictable. And, I have learned how to communicate with him and trust him in that. So yeah, I think that was a really roundabout answer for him. But then Izzy, who's the mare that I lost, she was very young when she passed. Unfortunately, we had a freak accident, but she came to me pretty much unhandled. She had just a little bit of handling, but she really flipped what I knew about horses on its head in the best way
The ones that
possible.
usually do.
Yeah, and I could do everything with her at Liberty in the beginning, like grooming, I could doctor up her wounds, I could lead her around. As soon as a rope came out of any kind, she was like, no, I am not interested. And we don't really know about her background or where she came from or anything, but she was the most rewarding, maybe. I don't know. They're all rewarding in different ways.
Yeah.
She really challenged me in so
Yeah.
many ways because I really had to learn how to connect in a very different way. I think Bentley was more outspoken. He was kind of loud, and I could be loud back and it would be okay.
Yeah.
And of course we were quiet too, but sometimes
Right.
he would be
Yeah.
like, no, I'm not doing that. I'd be like, yeah, you are. And he'd be like, well, you're not asking like that. And you kind of have those. And Izzy was more like, oh, you asked like this, I'm going to answer like an explosion. And I'd be like, whoa, I literally just, I just want you to do this. And I think I was grounded and I think I was, aware of my energy. And she would be like, not quite there yet, right? Like, I'm not doing
Yeah.
it.
Very so.
But yeah, so we ended up, I had her for about 2 years. And to this day, I'm devastated by her loss.
Yeah, it's so hard.
Yeah. But she taught me more in that 2 years than I've ever learned from a horse over time. And then Fergus, who's my paint cross, we got him actually for my husband. And he is the biggest just love bug ever. He just loves to be in your space. He's super kind and tolerant and will set boundaries, but is very soft about them and will say, I don't think you want to ask like that. I think you want to do this. And, if he gets nervous, you can just pet him and say, like, he likes to be pet. Bentley doesn't like to be pet. But Fergus, you can give him a scratch and he'd be like, you're all right, bud. And he's like, okay, I'm good.
Yeah.
And like move
You
forward.
say so, I
And
trust
yeah,
you.
exactly. So I think, all of the horses I worked with, they're modeling relationships and they're modeling communication and they all communicate in such different ways. And I think I've been able to, adapt all of these things to my students, to my family, to somebody at the grocery store, right? Like you can feel when someone's having a bad day in front of you in line, right? Or in back of you in line. And, being aware of my energy and how my space is impacting someone else's or how my boundaries, whether I'm setting them intentionally or not, or impacting others, I think, it has a tremendous impact on just how I move through life. And yeah, I'm so grateful for that opportunity. And, anytime I get to meet a new horse or work with a new horse, I'm so, so grateful for the opportunity because they all have something very different to bring to the table. I'm just like a human. And I think that, it just means so much to me. And I can never fully explain what they've done for me, but it's been a lot.
They are such incredible teachers and just the different horses that come into your life at different times. It's really interesting to see how that plays out for so many people because a lot of times, just like you said, you get this really difficult horse and it's like, I actually needed all the lessons that you had to teach me, even though I didn't necessarily want them.
Yep.
Really cool opportunities for personal growth if you take it that way, if you're willing to be open to that experience.
Yeah. And I think the willingness to be open is the key piece. And that's something that, over time, like I just keep encountering over and over and over again. And, as someone who does like the equine-assisted work, but also has taught lessons and, worked with problem horses in the past, right? It's all about the person's willingness to really see and really feel what's in front of them and what's inside of them, right? And how those things connect. And a lot of times not always, but a lot of times the issues that we see within human horse relationships are, it's because there's a lack of communication happening between the two. And you really have to be willing to look at that and willing to say, my horse isn't naughty. My horse isn't whatever label you want to put on your horse.
Terminology a little
Yeah. And kind of dig into that. And I think I love helping people find that. And I love holding people accountable to that. And I think sometimes, like when I first work with people, they're like, wait, what? Like, why does it matter what I did at work today before we go into the arena? And I'm like, because I need to know. Because, I need to know what's going to happen. And they're like, why does it matter? Yeah. And what does it matter? And I'm like, well, you tell me what it matters. And then they're like, oh, yeah. So, when you walk in the door at home, the energy you bring home affects your kids, your spouse, your animals, right? The trajectory of your night if you come in with one energy over another. And I think, it's one of my favorite things to do is to watch individuals and horses just blossom because people took a step back and said, oh, like I'm digging into this further. Like there is something happening beyond the label that I or others have given this relationship.
Yeah. They really do help us hone in our self-awareness instead of moving on autopilot and making those
Yes.
assumptions, that they're being naughty or they just don't feel like it today or whatever. Well, why don't they feel like it? Like, why are they
Yeah.
resisting something they normally do? But to really,
Yeah.
start to question, our thoughts, what we're going in with, what we're assuming, and of course, super great lessons for life and relationships, right? Like you kind of question and wonder and be curious instead of feel like we know all the answers and this is
Mm-hmm.
the way it has to be. So
Mm-hmm. And
that's
I
really
think too,
cool.
and when you get too confident, you're like, oh, I figured this one out, or I know this situation. That's often when they're like, nope.
Yeah.
And I think that to me, that's the exciting part is, trying something new or doing something differently, even though you've done it the same way for
Yeah.
however long.
That is exciting, and I think it's something that's really opening up in the horse world is kind of there are lots of different paths and ways, and it's okay to be curious and not have all the answers and to try stuff. And so I love that there's more and more people talking about that, yeah, maybe you were taught one way, but maybe another way
Mm-hmm.
is going to be better for you or equally good, or at least explore it and see what
Mm-hmm.
happens. So
Mm-hmm.
that's neat. I like that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, tell everybody if there's things we can do to support your work, where we can find you, all that
Sure.
good stuff.
Sure. So I lead the Human Animal Partnerships and Interactions Lab, or the Happy Lab, at Purdue. So I think I shared our website with
Yeah,
everyone so you can
that will
check
be
out
in the link
kind
notes.
of what
That
we're
link will be
doing
in the notes.
research-wise. Perfect. And then my personal website, which is just a different reflection of what I'm currently working on, is leanne-nieforth.com. But yeah, I'd love if anybody wants to talk about research or has ideas for research partnerships. I partner with nonprofits across the country to do my work. And I always love chatting with practitioners just because research isn't helpful unless it's reaching the people who are actually doing the work. And I
Yeah.
think that's my mindset, is to make sure that what I'm doing as a researcher is directly benefiting the people who are doing the work, or in this case, the people who are interacting with horses or helping people with horses or helping horses.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I just want to commend you for doing this work. I think it is so
Thank you.
needed because a lot of us, like we've talked about, we kind of know that there's something there. It can be hard to describe. And like you say, when we live in the world that we live in now, you need
Hmm.
that proof that
Hmm.
things are working and you need that explanation of why they're working so
Hmm.
that, like you say, insurance companies will be like, okay, maybe we will put money here because look, it works and people are getting better.
Right.
And it's saving lives and doing all these things. So I
Exactly.
really love that you're going into that world, breaking it apart so that hopefully in the future it will be something that's more mainstream. It will be something that people know about and see and that
Hmm.
there is support for. So thank you
Well,
for
thank you.
all your work there. And thanks for coming on and talking all
Thanks.
about horses and everything that you're finding out and learning and gaining support for.
Thanks for having me. Yeah. And thanks for this podcast. It's been wonderful to listen to it.
Your greatest asset and your greatest barrier is your mind. I offer individualized coaching opportunities for those wanting to understand how you can turn your mind from an enemy to an ally so you can achieve your goals and live the life you dream of. Visit thetouchofamustang.org for more information. Thank you for joining us and learning about horses that heal and the humans who help them. We hope you'll continue with us on this journey. We'd love for you to subscribe on your favorite platform and follow The Touch of a Mustang on any of the major social media outlets. Please share with your friends, anyone who loves horses, or anyone who might be struggling and could benefit from this message. If you have felt the healing power of horses or help them in their divinely appointed mission, please reach out. We want to hear your story. As we say goodbye, always remember that the horse is always there to help you heal.